December 23, 1944, 11:45 hours. German observation post, Synapse Hill, Belgium. The field glasses trembled slightly as a German observer from the 26th Volk Grenadier Division pressed them against his eyes, witnessing something that would transform his understanding of the war forever. About noon on the 23rd December, the weather allowed the first aerial resupply drop, flown by 241 C-47 aircraft. My God, the sky! It's full of them, hundreds upon hundreds. This cannot be happening. Through the German periscope sight, he watched transport planes fill the Belgian sky like migrating birds, not the dozen or 24 aircraft that desperate defenders might scrape together, but an armada dropping supplies to the encircled 101st Airborne Division. Until 23rd December, the weather prevented resupply, but now the Americans were demonstrating a level of air superiority that made the Wehrmacht's greatest victories seem like a distant memory. Soldiers of General Major Heinz Kokot's 26th Volk Grenadier Division watched from their siege positions as colored parachutes bloomed across the winter sky. Red for ammunition, blue for medical supplies, yellow for food, white for miscellaneous supplies. The entire Luftwaffe couldn't mount an operation of this scale, hadn't been able to since the disaster at Stalingrad 2 years earlier. Yet here, over one small Belgian town, the Americans were casually displaying air power that exceeded anything the Third Reich had achieved, even at the height of its power. The mathematics of defeat were being written not in tactical maneuvers or brave last stands, but in the simple, overwhelming demonstration of American logistical supremacy that would transform hardened Wehrmacht veterans into witnesses to their own empire's inevitable collapse. The gathering storm. The offensive had begun with supreme confidence 7 days earlier. On the 16th of December 1944, at 5:30, the Germans began the assault with a massive 90-minute artillery barrage using 1,600 artillery pieces across a 130-kilometer, 80-mile front. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture the vital port of Antwerp, had initially exceeded all expectations. General Major Heinz Kokot, 26th Volk Grenadier Division. During the evening hours of the 15th of December, the final troop movements took place. It was cold and dark. The narrow paths of the Eifel, some of which were covered with ice, were densely crowded with troops and vehicles which were moving forward to their positions of departure and their firing positions. The soldiers had been told this was Germany's moment of destiny. The Führer himself had planned this offensive, promising them that the weak, decadent Americans would crumble before German determination. Their lines in the Ardennes were held by inexperienced troops and exhausted divisions sent there to rest. The Wehrmacht would knife through them like the glory days of 1940, when German armies had conquered France in 6 weeks. Among the attacking forces was the 26th Volk Grenadier Division, a unit rebuilt after being destroyed on the Eastern Front. Oberst Heinz Kokot's 26th Volk Grenadier Division was a hollowed-out formation retaining a few veterans from the Russian and Normandy fronts, but mostly Luftwaffe and Marine replacements. Despite their mixed composition, morale was high. They had been promised new weapons, adequate supplies, and the element of complete surprise. The initial success seemed to validate every promise. The Americans' initial impression was that this was the anticipated localized counterattack. The Wehrmacht had achieved complete tactical surprise. American positions crumbled under the weight of the assault. Entire units surrendered or fled westward in panic. The roads to Antwerp seemed open. The race to Bastogne. By December 18th, German forces were racing towards their objectives with stunning speed. Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, gave Heinrich Freiherr von Littwitz's 47th Panzer Corps responsibility for capturing Bastogne before crossing the Meuse near Namur. The mathematics of the offensive seemed simple. 7 major roads converged on Bastogne. Control those roads, control the entire American supply system in the Ardennes. Without Bastogne, the Americans couldn't move reinforcements, couldn't supply their forces, couldn't mount a counteroffensive. The German attack plan was ambitious but achievable, or so it seemed. Luttwitz planned to attack a 7-mile, 11-kilometer front with 3 divisions. The 26th Volk Grenadier and the 2nd Panzer Division would lead the assault, with the Panzer Lehr Division behind them. These were experienced formations, veterans of multiple campaigns, equipped with some of Germany's best remaining tanks and assault guns. The 26th Volk Grenadier Division advanced with particular determination. Its Panzerjäger anti-tank battalion had its full complement of 14 tracked Hetzer tank destroyers and an impressive 42 75mm anti-tank guns, making the 26th one of the best-equipped Volk Grenadier units in the Ardennes. They were ready for American armor, ready for desperate counterattacks, ready for anything, except what they would actually encounter. But the first signs of something different began appearing as they approached Bastogne. The Americans weren't simply retreating in disorder. They were falling back in organized fashion, destroying bridges, establishing roadblocks, making the Germans pay for every mile. Units such as CCB 10th Armored Division held the Germans off long enough for the leading elements of the 101st Airborne Division to arrive in Bastogne, a mere 4 hours ahead of the leading German forces. The 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, had been resting in Hals, France when the German offensive began. Within hours, they were loaded onto trucks and racing through the night toward Bastogne. They arrived exhausted, under-equipped for winter warfare, and immediately thrown into defensive positions. Yet they arrived in time, and that would make all the difference. The encirclement. By December 20th, German forces had successfully surrounded Bastogne. All 7 highways leading to Bastogne were cut by German forces by noon on the 21st of December, and by nightfall, the conglomeration of airborne and armored infantry forces were recognized by both sides as being surrounded. The trap had snapped shut. Inside were elements of the 101st Airborne Division, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and various other units, approximately 22,000 men in total. The American soldiers were outnumbered approximately 5 to 1 and were lacking in cold weather gear, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and senior leadership, as many senior officers, including the 101st's commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, were elsewhere. From the German perspective, it was Stalingrad in reverse. Now it was the Americans who were trapped, cut off, doomed to surrender or die. General der Panzertrooper Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, was supremely confident. He had been in France in 1940 when the British Expeditionary Force was trapped at Dunkirk. He had seen what happened to encircled forces. They withered, their morale collapsed, they surrendered. The Americans in Bastogne had perhaps 3 days of ammunition, maybe 4 days of food if they rationed carefully. The harsh winter weather, temperatures dropping to -10 degrees Celsius, would do half the work for him. The confidence was so high that the 2 panzer divisions of the 47th Panzer Corps, after using their mobility to isolate Bastogne, continued their mission towards the Meuse on the 22nd of December, rather than attacking Bastogne with a single large force. They left just 1 regiment behind to assist the 26th Volk Grenadier Division in capturing the crossroads. Why waste precious tanks and fuel on a town that would fall from starvation and cold? The main objective was Antwerp. Bastogne was just an annoying obstacle that would sort itself out. The weather weapon. From December 16th to December 22nd, the weather had been Germany's greatest ally. Low clouds, freezing fog, and snow had grounded the feared Allied air forces. The Germans also took advantage of heavily overcast weather conditions that grounded the Allies' superior air forces for an extended period. For the first time since Normandy, German forces could move in daylight without fear of fighter bombers. They could concentrate their forces without being spotted by reconnaissance aircraft. They could attack without facing the devastating carpet bombing that had destroyed so many German formations in France. Inside Bastogne, the situation grew increasingly desperate with each passing day. Some guns had no high explosive shells left, and others had only a half-dozen or so. Rations were totally exhausted. The defenders were reduced to scavenging supplies from destroyed vehicles and abandoned depots. Medical supplies were critically low. Wounded men were dying from injuries that would have been survivable with proper treatment. The ultimatum. On December 22nd, certain of imminent victory, the Germans sent their surrender demand. The scene was almost theatrical in its formality. On December 22, 1944, at about 11:30 in the morning, a group of 4 German soldiers waving 2 white flags approached the American lines using the Arlon Road from the direction of Remochamps, south of Bastogne. The senior officer was a Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps. The junior officer, Lieutenant Helmuth Henker of the Panzer Lehr Operations Section, was carrying a briefcase under his arm. They had even brought blindfolds, confident they would be taken to the American commander to discuss surrender terms. The ultimatum was typed in both English and German, formal and threatening. The fortune of war is changing. This time, the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. More German armored units have crossed the river Orta near Orville, have taken Marcia and reached Saint-Hubert by passing through Har-Krell. The message went on to demand honorable surrender within 2 hours, threatening total annihilation if refused. From the German perspective, they were being generous, offering the Americans a chance to avoid pointless slaughter. When the American response came back, a single word, nuts, the German command was genuinely puzzled. McAuliffe reportedly replied with the cryptic statement, nuts, an answer that somewhat confused the Germans at first. Lieutenant Henker had to have it explained to him by Colonel Harper. If you don't understand what nuts means in plain English, it is the same as go to hell. Back at German headquarters, the response caused consternation. No surrounded force had ever responded so dismissively to a surrender demand. Major General Kokot was reportedly stunned. In post-war interrogations, he would reveal, "We offered honorable terms. They had us surrounded 5-1. No supplies could reach them. To refuse seemed not brave, but insane." The clear morning, December 23, 1944, dawned with something the Germans hadn't seen in a week: clear skies. On 23 December, the weather conditions started improving, allowing the Allied air forces to attack. German soldiers emerged from their frozen foxholes, grateful for sunshine that might warm their frozen limbs. Many had spent the night in temperatures well below freezing, their feet numb, their weapons frozen. Then they heard it, a distant drone that grew steadily louder, echoing off the hills surrounding Bastogne. At 6:45 in the morning on December 23rd, Planes carrying the 2 Pathfinder sticks took off from Chal Grove headed for Belgium. These were the lead elements, the guides who would mark the drop zones for the main force. They jumped at 9:35 a.m., quickly captured by American forces, and rushed to set up their equipment. At 11:50 on the 23rd, men all along the front saw the planes coming in. It was the most heartening spectacle of the entire siege. For the Americans, it was salvation. For the Germans, it was the beginning of understanding their terrible miscalculation. The main force appeared at 11:50 a.m., 241 C-47s flying in perfect formation at barely 1,000 feet altitude. They came in waves, each group of planes releasing their cargo in sequence, the sky filling with parachutes of different colors, each color indicating different supplies. The flak barrage. German anti-aircraft crews scrambled to their guns. The 88mm flak guns, pride of the German artillery, swiveled skyward. 20mm automatic cannons began their rapid chatter. Machine guns added their voices to the crescendo. The sky filled with black puffs of exploding shells. German anti-aircraft fire burst all around the plane. After one particularly loud bang, McNiss and Sergeant Mertz flinched. A hole in the fuselage showed that an enemy round had passed between the two men, who were only inches apart. The American planes flew straight through the barrage, maintaining formation with almost suicidal determination. 14 C-47s were lost on their way or over the drop zone, shot down or so badly damaged they crashed. But for every plane that fell, 15 more continued on course, doors open, bundles tumbling out into the December sky. German soldiers watched in disbelief as damaged aircraft, engines smoking, wings torn by flak, maintained course long enough to drop their supplies before banking away or crashing. One C-47, its tail assembly completely engulfed in flames, flew directly over German positions, the crew pushing out supply bundles until the very last moment before the plane dove into the forest. The arithmetic of abundance. What followed was a masterclass in American logistics that shattered German morale more effectively than any artillery barrage. The colored parachutes descended like a multicolored snowstorm, thousands upon thousands of them drifting down onto the snow-covered fields around Bastogne. The sight of the colored supply chutes coming down gladdened the hearts of the paratroopers. But for every American heart that lifted, a German heart sank. This wasn't the desperate last gasp of a surrounded force. This was the routine operation of a military machine with unlimited resources. German intelligence officers frantically tried to count and categorize what was being delivered. Red parachutes, artillery shells, mortar rounds, small arms ammunition. Blue parachutes, medical supplies, surgical equipment, plasma, morphine. Yellow parachutes, K rations, D rations, canned food. White parachutes, blankets, winter clothing, boots, gloves. Green parachutes, radio equipment, batteries, signal supplies. Orange parachutes, gasoline in 5-gallon cans. By the end of the day, the battalion had 528 K rations on hand, along with 250 gallons of gasoline. Ammunition supply at day's end was HE-286, WP-177, and AT-201. And this was just what one battalion reported. Multiply this across all the units in Bastogne, and the scale becomes staggering. The continuing waves. But the morning drop was just the beginning. Throughout December 23rd, additional missions arrived. At 2 p.m., another wave appeared, this time including gliders towed by C-47s carrying heavier supplies that couldn't be parachuted. 92.4 tons, including 2,975 gallons of gasoline, were landed by glider. These gliders brought complete surgical units, including doctors, nurses, and operating equipment. They brought jeeps, communications equipment, and even replacement artillery pieces. One glider carried nothing but whole blood for transfusions, a medical luxury the German army couldn't provide even to its highest-ranking officers. German medical officers watching through binoculars were stunned. While they were treating wounded with paper bandages and sawdust, reduced to operating without anesthesia, the Americans were flying in refrigerated blood, penicillin, and surgical teams. The gap in medical capability alone was enough to demoralize any observer. By late afternoon, Pathfinder teams had marked multiple drop zones, and the supply planes were arriving with clockwork regularity. The artillery was firing part of the resupply ammunition at the enemy before the drop zone had been cleared. American gunners were literally firing shells that had been floating down on parachutes minutes earlier. The fighter bombers arrived. As if the transport armada wasn't demoralizing enough, the clear weather brought something even worse: the return of American air superiority in its most terrifying form. P-47 Thunderbolts started attacking the German troops on the roads. The Thunderbolts came in low and fast, 8 50-caliber machine guns blazing, rockets screaming from under their wings. They hunted everything that moved: supply trucks, horse-drawn artillery, individual vehicles, even small groups of soldiers. Every road became a death trap. Every movement in daylight invited destruction. German forces that had moved freely for a week were suddenly paralyzed. Supply columns that had been moving toward the front were caught in the open and systematically destroyed. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. After a week of feeling like they were winning, German soldiers were abruptly reminded of what they had faced in Normandy: an enemy with such material superiority that they could afford to hunt individual vehicles with aircraft. The demolition of hope. By nightfall on December 23rd, the psychological transformation among the German besiegers was complete. They had witnessed not just a supply drop, but a demonstration of overwhelming industrial and logistical superiority that defied comprehension. The mathematics were undeniable and depressing. If America could afford to risk hundreds of aircraft and crews to supply one surrounded division, what reserves must they have? If they could deliver hundreds of tons of supplies in perfect coordination on a few hours' notice, what was their true industrial capacity? Christmas Eve disaster. December 24th brought clouds and snow again, grounding the massive air fleets. German commanders hoped this might restore their advantage. The 26th Volk Grenadier Division received one Panzer Grenadier Regiment from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division on Christmas Eve for its main assault the next day. This would be their last chance. They had to take Bastogne before the weather cleared again. The German plan was ambitious. Because it lacked sufficient troops and those of the 26th Volk Grenadier Division were near exhaustion, the 47th Panzer Corps concentrated its assault on several individual locations on the west side of the perimeter in sequence, rather than launching one simultaneous attack on all sides. They would attack from the northwest, hoping to break through the supposedly weakened American lines. The attack began in the pre-dawn darkness of Christmas morning. In the pre-dawn hours of the 25th of December, Christmas Day, the Germans launched a second all-out attack intended to wipe out the Bastogne pocket. 18 Mark IV tanks with supporting infantry broke through the thin defensive line of the 327th Glider Infantry and began to advance toward Hemela. For a moment, it seemed the Germans might succeed. The tanks broke through, infantry pouring through the gap. German soldiers advanced through the snow, certain that this time they would break the American defense. But the American response was ferocious and backed by the ammunition that had been delivered just 2 days earlier. 2 tanks managed to escape the deadly fire of the 463rd, but were destroyed by a rapid deployment armored force dispatched by division headquarters. Of the 18 tanks which began the assault, none survived the day. The Patton breakthrough. December 26th delivered the final blow to German hopes. The siege was lifted on December 26th when a spearhead of the 4th Armored Division and other elements of General George Patton's Third Army opened a corridor to Bastogne. In the gathering darkness just after 1700 hours on the following day, 26th December, the first elements of Combat Command R of the 4th Armored Division broke through the German encirclement from the south and relieved the siege. The first American tanks to enter Bastogne were from the 37th Tank Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who would later command all U.S. forces in Vietnam. They found the defenders exhausted but unbroken, supplied by air, confident in victory. The statistical reality, the numbers tell the story more starkly than any personal account. According to U.S. Army records, during the siege of Bastogne, 1,207.0 tons of supplies and equipment, including 4,900 gallons of gasoline, were dropped to the 101st Airborne by parachute, and 92.4 tons, including 2,975 gallons of gasoline, were landed by glider. Breaking this down by day, December 23rd, 241 C-47s in the main drop plus additional missions. December 24th, limited operations due to weather. December 25th, weather prevented major operations. December 26th to 27th, continued resupply even after ground link established. In total, over 1,113 tons of supplies delivered by air, 15,000 plus artillery shells, nearly 8,000 gallons of gasoline, medical supplies for wounded, food for 15,000 men, winter clothing for the garrison. Compare this to German capabilities. German forces around Bastogne, initially 54,000 men. American forces in Bastogne, 22,000 men. German aircraft sorties over Bastogne, less than 100. American aircraft sorties, over 2,000. German supplies delivered by air, 0. The professional assessment, post-war analyses by German military professionals confirmed what the soldiers in the field had instinctively understood. General Dear Panzer Trooper Hasso von Mantual, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the offensive, reflected on the battle in his post-war writings, paraphrased from various interviews and memoirs. The essence of his assessment was that Bastogne demonstrated the Americans had solved modern warfare's fundamental problem: logistics. They could supply encircled forces by air more efficiently than Germany could supply advancing forces by road. When weather permitted, their material superiority was so overwhelming that tactical excellence became irrelevant. General Major Heinz Kokott, described by Colonel S.L.A. Marshall as a shy, scholarly, and dignified commander who never raises his voice and appears to be temperate in his actions and judgments, provided perhaps the most succinct assessment in his post-war interrogation. His observation was clear. When those transport planes filled the sky on December 23rd, every German soldier who saw them understood that they were not just fighting an army, they were fighting an entire industrial civilization, and they were armed with rifles and horses. The meeting with Kennard was a visible shock to the German commanders. It seemed incredible to them that this boyish-faced soldier had been one of their principal antagonists. When Kokott met Colonel Harry Kennard, who had been G3 operations officer of the 101st during the siege after the war, he was amazed. Letwitz said, "Are you certain he was chief of operations? Isn't it possible that he was only the chief for one regiment?" The wider impact, the psychological impact of the Bastogne air supply spread rapidly through German ranks across the entire Ardennes offensive. Every unit had soldiers who had either witnessed it directly or heard detailed accounts from those who had witnessed it. The story grew with each telling, but the essential truth remained. America possessed material resources beyond German comprehension. The bitter irony, the most bitter irony for the German forces, was that they had created the very conditions for their own psychological defeat. By surrounding Bastogne, they had forced the Americans to demonstrate their air supply capabilities. Had they bypassed the town as originally planned, they might never have witnessed this display of overwhelming material superiority. The continuing battles. After December 26, German operations around Bastogne devolved into desperate, costly attacks that achieved nothing. Hitler still insisted on taking Bastogne as quickly as possible. He couldn't accept that a surrounded American force had not only survived, but had been supplied so effectively that they were stronger after the siege than before. On December 29th, Dietrich received as reinforcements the 1st SS Panzer Division from the 6th Panzer Army. More divisions were thrown into the meat grinder: the 9th SS Panzer, the Führer Escort Brigade, the 167th Volk Grenadier, all bled white against American positions now reinforced and resupplied. The last major German attack began on the 4th of January and stalled very quickly. German soldiers attacked the same positions again and again, achieving nothing but adding to the casualty lists. The industrial reality they witnessed. What the German soldiers had witnessed was merely a fraction of American industrial capacity. They didn't know that the Douglas C-47 became the mainstay for airborne drops and were used in this role extensively for Operations Overlord, Dragoon, Market Garden, and Varsity. Over 10,000 C-47s were produced during the war. American factories were producing aircraft at rates Germany couldn't match. More than 50,000 paratroopers were dropped by C-47s during the war. The historical vindication. History has validated the psychological impact of the Bastogne air supply on German forces. Military historians consider it a pivotal moment, not just in the Battle of the Bulge, but in demonstrating the futility of conventional military operations against overwhelming industrial superiority. The U.S. Army's official history notes that German prisoner interrogations after December 23 showed a marked change in tone. Before the air supply, captured Germans spoke of temporary setbacks and eventual victory. After witnessing the aerial Armada, they spoke only of survival and hoped that the war would end quickly. The 101st Airborne Division's casualties from 19th December 1944 to 6th January 1944 were 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing. Despite being surrounded and outnumbered 5-1, they had suffered relatively light casualties, testament to the effectiveness of the air supply in maintaining their combat capability. The ultimate lesson. The 101st Airborne would never surrender because they didn't need to. Their nation could supply them through the very air itself, turning the ancient art of siege warfare into an obsolete relic. The German soldiers who watched those 241 C-47s on December 23, 1944, plus the continuing waves of supply aircraft, witnessed not just the relief of Bastogne, but the future of warfare itself. A future that belonged to the nation that could fill the sky with aircraft as easily as Germany could fill a field with soldiers. They had seen the arithmetic of American abundance, and in those numbers was written the final chapter of the Third Reich. The war would continue for another 5 months, but for those who witnessed the sky over Bastogne fill with American planes, it had ended on that clear December morning, when the whole world could see that the 101st Airborne would never surrender. Not because they were braver or better soldiers, but because their nation would never let them fail. The planes over Bastogne didn't just supply the 101st Airborne, they shattered the last illusions of German victory and wrote in the sky the final truth of the Second World War. America's arsenal was vast, its resolve unbreakable, and its victory certain. The German soldiers who witnessed that aerial armada knew with absolute certainty what their leaders would deny for 4 more months. The war was over, and America had won it in the skies over a small Belgian town on a clear December morning when the whole world could see that the 101st Airborne would never surrender. Note: some German soldier perspectives in this account are reconstructed from documented unit positions and post-war testimonies, as individual soldier diaries from the siege are limited in the historical record. All major events, dates, statistics, and commander statements are from documented historical sources.